We live in a world in which the local is as closely linked to the global as it has ever been in our long human history. What I'd like to do in this lecture is introduce a different way of looking at our world in recent times beyond some of the typical interpretations of globalization that see globalizing trends as either inherently good or essentially bad. Globalization does not spread material prosperity or cultural unity throughout the world to eliminate poverty, inequality, or conflict. Globalization does not necessarily pulverize local distinctiveness or establish a homogeneous, bland cultural sameness everywhere among people reduced to mindless consumers who want only KFC, Coca-Cola, and smartphones. It can entail these things in some cases, but this isn't the world we live in now, nor is it likely to be the world of the future. Instead, we see a much more complicated interaction of continuity and change that often appears to be an amplification of patterns seen in the past. The key to understanding these new manifestations of older patterns requires us to consider the relationship between the local and the global. We tend to view this globalization thing as a process through which a few cultural, economic, and political forces come to dominate most places and replace local ways. It's not quite so simple, however. It may be that the range of diversity has been contracting. For example, the number of distinct languages spoken in our world appears to be shrinking. One source of information on this topic claims that the linguistic diversity of the world has decreased by 20% over the last 40 years, while an increasing proportion of the world's population, about half now, speaks only 25 of the 7,000 languages that exist today. This linguistic process is tied to growing urbanization, nationalism, economic incentives to speak certain languages, and so many of the other historical developments that we've looked at in this course. Yet when we look at the list of the major 25 languages, we see that they come from different language families, they have very different grammars and vocabularies, and they include speech forms from diverse societies. It is also worth considering that the increased use of shared languages facilitates other forms of cultural creativity and the formation of new kinds of communities. But even when global trends appear to dominate, we see that the local context has its impacts on the external influences. One very clear example of this relates to that most potent expression of globalizing food culture and economics, McDonald's. Our textbook includes the graphic of McDonald's franchises around the world, which seems to reflect the broad reach of American food culture and market presence. However, we must remember that McDonald's can serve an Indian market of 1 billion people, but none of the McDonald's franchises there will serve a single beef patty because of the prohibition on meat eating, most notably the flesh of cattle. What is McDonald's without its famous hamburger or Big Mac? Which change is most remarkable, the introduction of an American fast food chain, or that chain dropping its most fundamental ingredient to serve a new massive market? Maybe globalization is not as simple as we might think. We could say the same about other globalizing trends, such as the spread of hip-hop aesthetics and music, or even Christianity and Islam. These influences from one part of the world can expand into new places, but they will not be reproduced and embraced unchanged. It has never been this way, and I doubt that we will ever see anything resembling a homogeneous global culture. Instead, the integration of the local and global will continue, and obscure local trends today will become the next global trends in a process that will occur over and over. We saw this with coffee. A local Ethiopian drink has become the premier stimulant and flavored beverage in the entire world over several centuries. At the same time, however, people back in Ethiopia continue to consume and experience coffee in the same ways as their ancestors did hundreds of years ago, when coffee began its global journey. Starbucks could go broke and close all its shops tomorrow, but yerga chefe will continue to be roasted and sipped as the best coffee known to humanity, if only in one part of Ethiopia. One of the reasons for following the history of coffee in our world since 1500 has been to see how something that we see as an unexceptional, ordinary thing reflected the complex web of connections over time and distance that we have created in the past several hundred years. We see this in the movement of coffee from Africa to Asia to Europe and the Americas, as well as between the Islamic world and Christendom. Also, we see the vast web of connections between the major historical trends that we've been looking at throughout this course. These connections refer to people and places, but they overlook the highest level of connection, the global environment, the ultimate interconnection of all of our planet's waters, lands, and atmospheres. These have always been connected, but we have not always been aware of it. Indeed, it seems that we have become aware of it as a byproduct of the globalization of our world, a process that accelerated greatly in the past few centuries. But even though we could not fully imagine this global environmental connection until recently, we have been agents in shaping this environmental connection for the entire duration of our human history. Just as our cup of coffee in the morning reflects a rich history of connection, it can also reveal how our global connections will continue to develop. This future depends on more than the economic, political, and biological connections that we have studied so far. It also depends on our connections to our global environment, connections that we can choose to acknowledge or ignore, but that we cannot choose to make or destroy. This kind of connection is best seen in this image of our world. This is one of my favorite images. It is a composite of nighttime satellite pictures so that it looks as though the entire planet is experiencing night at once, which of course is impossible. But it shows our presence on a global scale in a way that no other single image can. It reveals the combination of where we are and how we consume energy. These are probably the two biggest themes that affect our relationship to our global environment in the present: population and energy consumption. The rapid increase in both has also transformed that relationship such that we are far more productive and far more destructive. What we don't see in this image are national borders. Well, we see borders that are formed by shorelines, and we do see the light and dark contrast of the DMZ between South Korea and North Korea. But throughout almost the entire image, there are no clear indications of political boundaries that are the equivalent of lines drawn on a map. Instead, we see a lot of us and the glow of the world we have made with our use of fossil fuels. The bright glow of Europe and North America exhibits the recent power in all senses of the word, of the Western world in recent centuries. But if we were to see a time-lapse version of the same image over the past 15 to 20 years, we would see areas in and around China and India glowing increasingly brighter too. It is also worthwhile to note that hundreds of millions of people live in areas that are not very bright in this image. With that in mind, we see another aspect of the world we have made in which some consume far more than others. Our ways of making light show that we have transformed our planet on a scale large enough to be observed from space. In 1500, the beginning point for our course, a nighttime image like this would have been almost entirely dark. We have become increasingly powerful as individuals and societies by our ability to increase our numbers and harness energy sources. As such, each one of us is only one of 7 billion, but what we do as individuals has a greater impact now than ever before on our world as a whole and on others who also inhabit our world. That correlation between greater numbers and greater power began with our command of fire long ago, and it grew exponentially after we became farmers 12,000 years ago and users of massive amounts of fossil fuels 200 years ago. With greater numbers and increased power has come our ability to affect our environments on both local and global scales. When we talk about this ability today, we tend to focus on global warming and the human contribution to this process. I know this particular combination has become a politicized issue today since it has been tied to economic and government policies and so on. I'm not going to weigh in on any supposed debate about this, except to say that environments at both the local and global levels change, always have and always will. Why they change in the ways they do can be debated, but change is the norm. Our history is ultimately one long journey of learning to live with changing environments and our ability to employ the 3 basic responses: adapt, move, or die. Concerns and arguments about climate change, whether we are talking about global warming or little ice ages or whatever, as a global issue has reminded us of something that was fundamental to the cultures of our ancestors from the earliest times into relatively recent centuries. We live in environments that we cannot order or control. We can affect them, but we cannot control them. During the past couple of centuries, our technological advances in extracting and diverting natural resources have coupled with our confidence that we can carve up the world into contained entities called nation-states to give us a sense that we can control or master our world in all ways. The exponential growth of our power to access and use natural resources has blunted our awareness of the fundamental basis of our relationship to our local and global environments. It may be that we are entering a different phase in our development now, in which we recognize how our relationship to local and global environments has changed. When we think of globalization and environmental issues, we tend to focus on the largest global scale. But we have to see how the local and global are connected, so we must consider globalization and climate change at the most local points, the individual coffee farmer and the individual coffee drinker. It is at this level that global processes actually matter for real people, and this helps us to understand how the everyday things that farmers and consumers do shape global markets and global cultures. Coffee is a luxury good in that we don't need it as a food item. But the idea that climate change could make good coffee exceptionally rare and too expensive for most people, but won't lead to famines, shouldn't distract us from the fact that climate change will affect all tropical crops, and many of these tropical crops, especially coffee, are at the root of massive commercial and industrial enterprises. The global market in coffee trading is about $15 billion a year, second only to oil as a commodity. For those of us living in service-based job markets who need to make a wage or salary to buy all of our food and everything else we consume, anything that large that collapses will affect us. So to this point, I've focused on the human element of markets and consumption, but at the heart of this issue is the nature of agriculture. Despite our remarkable abilities to transform landscapes and introduce innovations that make farming possible in new locations and more productive than ever, there are very real limits to this. Coffee planting reveals these limits as the cultivation of the best kind of coffee, Arabica, is dependent on a narrow range of environmental factors such as temperature and water. While some crops have been modified to flourish in a wider range of conditions, coffee, at least good coffee, is not one of them. This video excerpt shows how changing environmental factors have affected coffee farmers and their crop in East Africa, one of the areas most susceptible to the patterns of climate change that we are seeing now.
We don't have money. We used to get money from this plantation. It was giving me 3,000 kilograms per year. The whole of these plantations now giving me around 500 kilograms per year.
The stems are drying up because of the weevils. We have even the rust from the leaves. And actually, the soils around are also not so fertile. As we can look around here, all our soils here, they are just the same. It has lost fertility. So our coffee is not doing so well.
Omwani wetu tulifuna munoga letu bero beno umyakani sachi randa kakanda kasuperera hesi angena hata mumwa akusizoni ngoma hanzo ngemyaka ngibiri semuchenoga isizoni senisara bangibiri semuchenoga ku muki hakutuketuke amumwa kathu amata twana no akabe betsana ye.
But now due to poor conditions of weather, you find that it brings flowers once, or they even drop by the way. They don't bring up berries. When coffee is affected by the drought or sunshine, our young ones are being sent away from school.
I think every beno chikanyika ngana ndio tukuna muhenduka nga biro betulemu beno omusho tumatunga every beno twabesitulisa stress suppose libe tuma yahikaku twatu chinauti every bimbula ive beta twabesa tunga kadibu mwezi neryo botukindi tukatunga embura na rekende ke hako kike haho neryo tukaitu atunga mwezi hambere yimbula neryo kana ngala ngero kutunga bomanga bamahenduka kunde mibere yetu atungire atingi ngumwisha atu utiono injo kutukabara biro bye season yetu alusheria hika.
IITA together with Oxfam wanted to come and in the Wenzoris to make a study to see the impact of climate change on coffee smallholder systems and also the livelihood of coffee smallholder farmers. And the farmers said that yes, climate change is happening. They said like yes, the rains are more erratic. Yes, we had a prolonged drought, so yes, it has an effect on our livelihood. Yes, you know, there are certain pests and diseases that are now more severe than before.
In recent years, variations in temperature and rainfall patterns in Uganda have been extreme. Droughts and floods have also increased. These shifting weather patterns connected to global climate change will likely affect Arabica coffee production. Predictions show that climate change will have an impact on the suitability of Arabica coffee in Uganda. Uganda is the second largest producer of coffee in Africa after Ethiopia and the 10th biggest in the world. An important export commodity, coffee has been the largest single earner of foreign exchange since the 1970s, accounting for an average 20 to 30% of Uganda's export revenue.
Coffee is the most important foreign exchange earner for Uganda. For example, last year, Uganda obtained 456 million United States dollars, which was a very big boost. And this year we are expecting around the same figure. If you combine all of the crops grown in Uganda, the amount of foreign exchange they earn for Uganda, they will still be lower than what coffee alone earns for the country.
However, the future of coffee production is uncertain. Uganda's position as a major coffee producer is under threat, as are the livelihoods of millions of Ugandans.
Coffee, in particular Arabica coffee, is very sensitive to the climate. Unfortunately, temperatures are increasing. There are many models, but all of these models in the end all predict a temperature increase. The only difference is, one says it's 1 degree in the next 40 years, the other one says no, by the time you're 40, 50 years further, we are already looking at 5 degrees. That is a tremendous increase. We have been trying to see how would the suitability of coffee production change if we take the average climate change scenario for the average model for the next decades. And what we see is quite dramatic. In East Africa and also in Uganda, we see the suitability of the areas reduce substantially, and a few tens of percent of the areas will even become quite unsuitable for coffee production. It shows that the production locations of the crop will keep shifting. The production at lower areas definitely will get some reduction in yields. Those effects definitely will affect the overall production of Arabica coffee.
The most visible effect of climate change is the shift in seasons. Previously, we used to start our coffee seasons at the beginning of August. They've been moved backwards to mid-September, and they end earlier than usual.
So once the coffee tree gets stressed by the drought and it all of a sudden rains, it will have the red cherry and the unripe cherry. The farmer will harvest everything. The green cherry will turn up into black beans during processing, and will lower the quality of coffee. It becomes harder for the farmers to harvest only the ripe cherry because they are all on the tree at the same time. Sometimes, if the beans haven't set, some of the berries will abort. They will die on the tree and they form black beans during processing.
The weather comes in changing gradually actually. During that time when conditions were good, actually coffee would bring flowers thrice.
When rain becomes very much, it can affect the coffee. And when sunshine becomes very much also, you can tie one seed like this, and you find when there is one seed dead and one seed which is good, as you have seen.
If there's one thing that we can learn from our long human history and our relationship to our environments, it is that we can adapt what we do to find answers to climate change. There are a number of innovative practices that could ameliorate some of the effects of climate change on coffee cultivation, but one of the most promising ideas is not so much creating a new global solution based on advanced technology, but returning to something old and very local. Whereas the global coffee crop is descended from a handful of ancestral coffee trees transplanted by Europeans in the past few centuries to the colonized areas of America, Asia, and Africa, the original Ethiopian plants retain a large degree of genetic diversity because farmers there, themselves descendants of some of the most innovative and productive farmers in human history, have maintained wild varieties and cultivated distinct regional varieties of coffee plants that have different environmental needs. This is the most local that coffee gets, and just as Ethiopia was the original source, it may be the best option for revitalizing the global coffee pool by dipping back into the highly localized source. Unfortunately, models of climate change indicate that the regions where wild or tended varieties of coffee grow now will no longer be suitable for coffee plants within 70 years. And as there was once a world without coffee, we may have to live in a world once again without coffee. What will we do when faced with these observed changes and information about possible future changes? When we look at our past, we find many examples of the ability to successfully adapt, as well as many examples of the failure to anticipate or respond to the need to adapt. We also see that people became increasingly effective at moving to address climate change. The agricultural colonization of parts of the Americas, Africa, and Asia by Western Europeans that we have seen throughout this course is an example of moving agricultural production in response to climate change. In this case, a cooling trend that became significant in the 1400s and continued into the mid-1800s. This movement of agriculture initiated the globalization of agricultural production and markets, which in turn fueled the rise of industrialization, to which many attribute the amplification of global warming observed in the past 150 years or so. And so here we are now, connected throughout our world by migrations, crops, markets, empires, wars, international organizations, pollution, and so on during the past few hundred years. Changes to our environments, local and global, do not have isolated effects because they ripple throughout this connected world that we have made. Here we see the original point of this lecture. Globalization does not necessarily lead to or even require the obliteration of all things local. Instead, globalization needs local societies and markets and plants and music and whatever to exist and to thrive as the global and the local are becoming bound closer and closer. This carries consequences, some of which can be seen as destructive and negative, but it also promises to provide the human and natural resources to redress some of these negative outcomes of the incredible ability of our people to grow in numbers and power. If our history reveals anything to us, it is that nothing is inevitable, as we have the capacity to succeed or fail based on the choices we make individually and together.